Well, because you brought up Joe, he's somebody like you I look up to. I've learned a lot from him
Yeah.
because I think who he is privately as a human being, also he's kind of the voice of curiosity to me. He inspired me that so unending, open-minded curiosity, much like you are the voice of reason. They recently had a podcast. Joe had recently had a podcast with Jordan Peterson, and he brought you up saying they still have a hope for you.
hmm Yeah.
Any
I saw
chance
that clip. Yeah. Yeah.
any chance you talk to Joe again and reinvigorate your friendship?
Yeah. Well, I reached out to him privately when I saw that
Did you
clip.
use the power of love?
Joe knows I love him and consider him a friend, right? So there's no issue there. Um, he also knows I'll be happy to do his podcast when we get that together. So there's no I have got no policy of not talking to Joe or not doing his podcast.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I think we got a little sideways along these same lines where we've talked about Brett and Elon and other people. Um, it was never to that degree with Joe because Joe's in a very different lane, right? And consciously so. I mean, Joe is a stand-up comic who interviews, who just is interested in everything, interviews the widest conceivable variety of people, and just lets his interests collide with their expertise or lack of expertise. I mean, again, it's a super wide variety of people. Um, he'll talk about anything, and he can always pull the ripcord, saying, I don't know what the fuck I'm saying. I'm a comic. I'm stoned. We just drank too much, right? Like it's very entertaining. It's all in, to my eye, it's all in good faith. I think Joe is an extraordinarily ethical, good person.
Also, doesn't use Twitter. Doesn't really use
Right.
Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah. No. But the crucial difference though is that because he is an entertainer first. I mean, I'm not saying he's not smart and he doesn't understand things. I mean, what's potentially confusing is he's very smart and he's also very informed. His full time job is talk. When he's not doing stand up or doing color commentary for the UFC, his full time job is talking to lots of very smart people at great length. So he's created the Joe Rogan University for himself, and he's gotten a lot of information crammed into his head. So it's not that he's uninformed, but he can always, when he feels that he's uninformed, or when it turns out he was wrong about something, he can always pull the ripcord and say, I'm just a comic. We were stoned. It was fun. Don't take medical advice from me. I don't play a doctor on the internet, right? Um, I can't quite do that, right? You can't quite do that. We're in different lanes. I'm not saying you and I are in exactly the same lane, but for much of Joe's audience, I'm just this establishment shill who's just banging on about the universities and medical journals and it's not true, but that would be the perception. And as a counterpoint to a lot of what's being said on Joe's podcast or certainly Brett's podcast on these topics, I can see how they would form that opinion. But in reality, if you listen to me long enough, you hear that I've said as much against the woke nonsense as anyone, even any lunatic on the right who can only keep that bright shining object in view, right? So there's nothing that Candace Owens has said about wokeness that I haven't said about wokeness insofar as she's speaking rationally about wokeness. But we have to be able to keep multiple things in view, right? If you could only look at the problem of wokeness and you couldn't acknowledge the problem of Trump and Trumpism and QAnon and the explosion of irrationality that was happening on the right and bigotry that was happening on the right, you were just disregarding half of the landscape. And many people took half of the problem in recent years. The last 5 years is a story of many people taking half of the problem and monetizing that half of the problem and getting captured by an audience that only wanted that half of the problem talked about in that way. And this is the larger issue of audience capture, which is very. I'm sure it's an ancient problem, but it's a very helpful phrase that I think comes to us courtesy of our mutual friend Eric Weinstein. And audience capture is a thing, and I believe I've witnessed many, casualties of it. And if there's anything I've been on guard against in my life, professionally, it's been that. And when I noticed that I had a lot of people in my audience who didn't like my criticizing Trump, I really leaned into it. And when I noticed that a lot of the other cohort of my audience didn't like me criticizing the far left and wokeness, they thought I was, exaggerating that problem.
Mhm.
I leaned into it because I thought those parts of my audience were absolutely wrong, and I didn't care about whether I was going to lose those parts of my audience. There are people who have created, knowingly or not, there are people who've created different incentives for themselves because of how they've monetized their podcast and because of the kind of signal they've responded to in their audience. Um, and I worry about, Brett would consider this a totally invidious ad hominem thing to say, but I really do worry that that's happened to Brett. I cannot explain how you do 100 with all the things in the universe to be interested in, and of all the things he's competent to speak intelligently about. I don't know how you do 100 podcasts in a row on COVID. Right? It's just
Mhm.
it makes no sense.
You think, in part, audience capture can explain that?
I absolutely think it can. Yeah.
What about, do you, like, for example, do you feel pressure to not admit that you made a mistake on COVID or made a mistake on Trump? I'm not saying you feel that way, but do you feel this pressure? So you've
No.
attacked audience capture within the way you do stuff, so you don't feel as much pressure from the audience, but within your own ego.
I mean, again, the people who think I'm wrong about any of these topics are going to think, okay, you're just not admitting that you're wrong. But then now we're having a dispute about specific facts. Um, there are there are things that I believed about COVID or worried might be true about COVID 2 years ago that I no longer believe or I'm not so worried about now, and vice versa. I mean, things have flipped. Certain things have flipped upside down. Um, the question is, was I wrong? So here's a cartoon version of it, but this is something I said probably 18 months ago, and it's still true. When I saw what Brett was doing on COVID, you know, let's call it 2 years ago, I, I, I said, even if he's right, if it turns out that ivermectin is a panacea and the mRNA vaccines kill millions of people, right? He's still wrong right now. His reasoning is still flawed right now. His facts still suck right now, right? And his confidence is unjustified now. That was true then. That will always be true then, right? And not much has changed for me to revisit any of my time points along the way. Again, I will totally concede that if I had teenage boys and their schools were demanding that they be vaccinated with the mRNA vaccine, I would I would be powerfully annoyed, right? I wouldn't know what I was going to do, and I would be doing more research about myocarditis, and I'd be badgering our doctors, and I would be worried that we have a medical system and a pharmaceutical system and a healthcare system and a public health system that's not incentivized to look at any of this in a fine-grained way, and they just want one blanket admonition to the entire population: just take the shot, you idiots. Uh, I view that largely as a panicked response to the misinformation explosion that happened, and the populist resistance animated by misinformation that just made it impossible to get anyone to cooperate. Right, so it's just part of it is, again, a pendulum swing in the wrong direction, somewhat analogous to the woke response to Trump and the Trumpist response to woke. Right, so there's a lot of people have just gotten pushed around for bad reasons, but understandable reasons. But yes, there are caveats to my things have changed about my view of COVID. But the question is, if you roll back the clock 18 months, was I wrong to want to platform Eric Topol, a very well respected cardiologist on this topic, or Nicholas Christakis to talk about the network effects of whether we should close schools. Right? He's had written a book on COVID. He's network effects are his wheelhouse both as an MD and as a sociologist. Um, there was a lot that we believed we knew about the efficacy of closing schools during pandemics, right? During the Spanish flu pandemic and others, right? But there's a lot we didn't know about COVID. We didn't know how negligible the effects would be on kids compared to older people. We didn't know
But my problem, I really enjoyed your conversation with Eric Topo, but also didn't. So he's one of the great communicators in many ways on Twitter, like distillation of the current data. But I hope I'm not overstating it, but there is a bit of an arrogance from him that I think could be explained by him being exhausted by being constantly attacked by conspiracy theory, like anti-vaxxers.
Yeah.
To me, the same thing happens with people that start drifting to being right wing. Is to get attacked so much by the left, they become almost irrational and arrogant in their beliefs. And I felt your conversation with Eric Topol did not sufficiently empathize with people that have skepticism, but also did not sufficiently communicate uncertainty we have. So like many of the decisions you made, many of the things you were talking about, were kind of saying there's a lot of uncertainty, but this is the best thing we could do now.
Well, it was a forced choice. You're going to get COVID. Do you want to be vaccinated when you get it?
Right.
That was always, in my view, an easy choice. And it's up until you start breaking apart the cohorts and you start saying, okay, wait a minute. There is this myocarditis issue in young men. Let's talk about that. When before that story emerged, it was just clear that this is, if it's not knocking down transmission as much as we had hoped, it is still mitigating severe illness and death. And I still believe that it is the current view of most people competent to analyze the data that we lost something like 300,000 people unnecessarily in the U.S. because of vaccine hesitancy.
But right? I think there's a way to communicate with humility about the uncertainty of things that would increase the vaccination rate.
I do believe that it is rational and sometimes effective to signal impatience with certain bad ideas, right? And certain conspiracy theories and certain forms of misinformation.
You think so?
Because it's just...
I just think it makes you look like a douchebag most times.
Well, no, I mean, certain people are persuadable, certain people are not persuadable, but it's... no, because there's not enough... It's the opportunity cost. Not everything can be given a patient hearing. It's like you can't have a physics conference and then let people in to just trumpet their pet theories about the grand unified vision of physics when they're obviously crazy, or they're obviously half crazy, or they're just not. The people. It's like you begin to get a sense for this when it is your wheelhouse. But there are people who kind of declare their irrelevance to the conversation fairly quickly without knowing that they have done it, right? And the truth is, I think I'm one of those people on the topic of COVID, right? It's never that I felt, listen, I know exactly what's going on here. I know these mRNA vaccines are safe. I know exactly how to run a lockdown. No, this is a situation where you want the actual pilots to fly the plane, right? We needed experts who we could trust. And insofar as our experts got captured by all manner of things, I mean, some of them got captured by Trump. Some of them were made to look ridiculous just standing next to Trump while he was bloviating about, whatever, that it's just going to go away. There's just 15 people. there's 15 people in a cruise ship and it's just going to go away. There's going to be no problem. Or it's like when he said many of these doctors think I understand this better than them. They're just amazed at how I understand this. And you've got doctors, real doctors, the heads of the CDC and NIH standing around just ashen faced while he's talking, all of this was deeply corrupting of the public communication of science on both. And then again, I've banged on about the depredations of wokeness. The woke thing was a disaster, right? Still is a disaster. But it doesn't mean that, but the thing is, there's a big difference between me and Brett in this case. I didn't do 100 podcasts on COVID. I did like 2 podcasts on COVID. The measure of my concern about COVID can be measured in how many podcasts I did on it, right? It's like once we had a sense of how to live with COVID, I was just living with COVID, right? Like, okay, get vaxxed or don't get vaxxed. Wear a mask or don't wear a mask. Travel or don't travel. Like you've got a few things to decide, but my kids were stuck at home on iPads, for too long. I didn't agree with that. It was obviously not functional. Like I criticized that on the margins, but there was not much to do about it. But the thing I didn't do is make this my life and just browbeat people with one message or another. We need a public health regime where we can trust what the competent people are saying to us about, what medicines are safe to take. And in the absence of that, craziness is going to, even in the presence of that, craziness is going to proliferate given the tools we've built. But in the absence of that, it's going to proliferate for understandable reasons. And it's not going to be good next time when something orders of magnitude more dangerous hits us. And that's, I spend, insofar as I think about this issue, I think much more about next time than this time.